Hi, everybody. Tonight I invite you to drift back with me to the age of the Vikings, a world shrouded in mist and salt spray, where the wind carried tales of restless oars and roaring fires. We often think of these seafarers as fierce raiders with horned helmets, yet behind the clash of swords and the cry of longships lies a far harsher truth. Life for the Vikings was brutal beyond measure. In this story, we shall wander through their frozen fjords, their smoke-filled longhouses, and their treacherous seas to glimpse the quiet moments and hidden struggles that shaped their unforgiving existence. Let your mind sail gently now as we begin our long voyage together. In a small coastal village, cradled by the icy arms of the North Sea, dawn crept slowly through drifting fog. The chill air smelled faintly of fish, salt, and damp wood. Here, the villagers stirred awake, not with lazy yawns, but with the heavy ache of survival pressing upon their bones. The thatched roofs glistened with frost, and the thin smoke rising from hearths was the only promise of warmth against the gnawing cold. Inside one such longhouse, a boy named Eric huddled near the embers, listening to his mother stir a pot of thin barley porridge. The walls around him were timbered and rough, the gaps filled with moss to keep out the wind. Yet drafts still whispered in, biting at his bare ankles. Eric's father, Leif, sat on a low stool, repairing a net with cracked, calloused hands. Each knot tied was a small hope that the sea might be generous today. Outside, men gathered near the shore, dragging their boats over icy stones toward the low tide. The sun, when it did rise, brought little comfort. Its pale rays gleamed coldly off the iron helmets and rough wool cloaks. These men were not raiders today, but fishers and farmers, their bellies as empty as the sea was wide. Hunger was an old friend in this land, a quiet shadow that lingered behind every door. To be born a Viking was not to be born into endless plunder, but into endless toil. The long winters were merciless, burying fields in snow and driving the people indoors for weeks at a time. Smoke gathered thick in the longhouses, clinging to the rough beams overhead. Children coughed through the dark hours, pressed close to the hearth while mothers mended clothes and fathers carved tools by fading lamplight. In the village, every life depended on the sea. It gave fish and passage to new lands, but it also took without mercy. Storms rose without warning, swallowing ships whole. Fathers vanished into the cold depths and returned only as stories whispered by grieving wives. Eric's older brother, Knut, had once sailed with a trading crew. He never returned, his fate tangled somewhere between wind and wave. Yet even at home, dangers lurked. The earth itself was cruel. Thin soil and short summers meant crops failed as often as they grew. When grain ran short, people mixed bark into their bread to stretch the meager harvests. Sometimes when spring thawed the fields, a cruel surprise awaited, sicknesses that spread like wildfire through the damp, crowded homes. The same hearth that gave warmth also bred disease. Still, life continued, because it must. Eric's mother, Fritis, had known hunger since her own childhood. Her hands were red and rough from scrubbing clothes in icy streams. Her eyes, though weary, shone with a quiet fierceness as she ladled the steaming porridge into wooden bowls. She pressed a warm hand to Eric's cheek, and for a moment he forgot the cold. After breakfast, Eric and his father trudged to the shore to mend the family's small fishing boat. It sat half buried in frozen sand, its hull scarred by years of salt and storm. Leif ran his fingers along the wood, tracing the old cracks. Each repair was a gamble. If the boat failed at sea, it would be the end of them. Yet to stay ashore was to starve. The other men spoke little as they worked, their breath misting the frigid air. They knew each wave could bring ruin or reward. Overhead, gulls wheeled and cried. Their calls were both blessing and omen. Sometimes the birds led them to fish. Sometimes they were the only voices to witness a boat slipping beneath the foam. In the evenings, the village gathered around flickering hearths to share stories, not just of gods and heroes, but of neighbors lost to the sea, of winters survived, of raids repelled. Children pressed close, wide-eyed, listening to tales of distant kingdoms and treasures beyond the horizon. These dreams offered warmth that the hearth alone could not give. For Eric, the nights were when he felt most alive. His father's deep voice spoke of Odin's wisdom, Thor's hammer, and the halls of Valhalla, where warriors feasted endlessly, free from hunger and cold. In those moments, Eirik wondered if the gods truly saw their struggles. Did Odin's ravens watch them shiver by smoky fires? Did Frey, the god of harvest, feel the bite of hunger that gnawed at his belly? As he drifted to sleep by the dying embers, Eirik dreamed of warm meadows, heavy with grain. He dreamed of sailing to lands where the sun lingered long and the earth was soft and kind. Yet when he woke, the harsh truth of the north always returned, a world where dreams froze like frost on a wooden beam. So begins our tale, a story of frost and fire, of hope and hardship, of simple folk whose bravery lay not only in the clash of swords, but in the quiet courage of facing each bitter dawn. Rest easy now, for tomorrow we shall follow Eirik and his people deeper into this rugged land, to discover why life for the Vikings was as brutal as the storms they sailed through. Let the cold winds lull you tonight, for we have many more leagues yet to journey together. The morning came with a hush of pale light slipping through the slats of the longhouse walls. Eirik stirred beneath a rough wool blanket, the warmth of sleep already stolen by the chill that crept over the earthen floor. He could hear his father's heavy steps outside, the creak of the door as Leif returned from tending to the boat, checking that it had not been dragged off by the restless tide or splintered by drifting ice. Freydis moved quietly about the hearth, adding splinters of driftwood to coax the embers alive. The glow flickered across her worn face, deepening the lines at the corners of her eyes, lines carved by years of squinting into the snow and salt spray. She hummed softly, an old song her mother had sung when the winds howled fiercest, a melody meant to hold back the fear that always waited beyond the door. Outside, the village braced for another day of cold labor. The sea was calm today, a deceptive kindness. Men shouldered nets stiff with frost, their breath rising in clouds as they spoke few words. Words wasted warmth, and warmth was life. A small band of boys, Eirik among them, trailed behind the men, each carrying a basket or a coil of rope, hoping to prove themselves useful enough to stand among the fishers when the time came. They reached the rocky cove where the boats bobbed in the shallow surf, their hulls crusted with salt and old tar. The tide was turning, the waves rolling in steady, rhythmic sighs. Eirik's bare feet stung where the icy water lapped at his ankles as he helped push the boat from the shore. Leif clapped a hand on his shoulder, rough but gentle. A silent praise for the boy's small strength. The men pushed off and climbed aboard, leaving the boys to wait with the old and the weary. Eirik watched his father's back until the boat became just another dark shape rocking against the endless gray. He shivered but kept his eyes on the horizon, imagining himself at the prow someday, spear in hand, his net heavy with fish, his stomach full for once. While the men were gone, the village settled into the hum of chores. Freydis joined the other women near the drying racks, gutting last week's catch under the watchful gaze of gulls that circled and squabbled overhead. Their hands moved quickly, blades flashing in the dim light as they saved every scrap of flesh and bone. Nothing was wasted. Even the fish heads were boiled into thin soups, the skins dried and sewn into rough cloaks for children too small for wool. Behind the longhouses, a patch of stubborn earth lay thawed enough for the oldest villagers to scratch at with crude wooden spades. They turned the soil, hoping to find signs that the next planting would take hold better than the last. But the ground was reluctant, still hard beneath the thin thaw. Each clod lifted was a prayer that the gods might favor them with a gentler season. Inside one longhouse, a young woman named Astrid rocked her newborn son, singing a lullaby so soft that only the child's fluttering eyelids knew its comfort. She worried over the hollow sound of his breaths, the way his skin stayed too cool no matter how tightly she wrapped him. The cold took the old and the very young first, a truth every mother knew too well. Still she sang, voice cracking, as if her song alone might ward off death. When the boats returned near dusk, the villagers gathered by the shore, eyes searching for signs of bounty or loss. Some days, the men came back with nets sagging, spirits lifted by the promise of full bellies. Other days, they returned empty-handed, shoulders bowed beneath more than the weight of their oars. Today, Eirik's father brought in a modest catch, a handful of cod, a few flatfish glistening wet in the gathering dusk. It was not enough to fill every stomach, but enough to stave off the deepest pangs. Leif handed Eirik a single small fish, its cold scales shining like hammered silver. The boy cradled it carefully, as if it were a treasure worth more than gold. In the longhouse that night, the family gathered close as Fridas gutted and roasted the fish over the fire, adding herbs she had dried from the last fleeting summer. The smell filled the cramped room, pushing back the damp scent of wet wool and tired bodies. They ate slowly, savoring each bite as though it might be the last taste of warmth before the snow returned. Afterward, Leif leaned back, his eyes heavy but awake enough to speak of distant lands again, of kingdoms across the sea where the soil was dark and rich, where fruit hung heavy on low branches, and cattle fattened without fear of wolves or snow. He spoke of traders who had sailed south and seen such wonders, who brought back silver coins and silk cloth, strange spices that smelled of sun and warmth. Eric listened with wide eyes, picturing himself standing on a foreign shore, barefoot in soft grass instead of cold mud. He wondered if one day he would see such places himself, or if he too would vanish into the sea's greedy mouth before he was old enough to lift a sword. Outside, the wind rose again, rattling the shutters and moaning through the cracks in the walls. Freydis pulled Eric close, tucking the blanket tight around his shoulders. She pressed her lips to his hair, whispering another fragment of that old song. The fire crackled low, shadows dancing on the beams as sleep came creeping in. In this land, dreams were both a comfort and a curse, for they showed what life could be, soft and kind, then vanished with the dawn, leaving only the raw truth of the cold north behind. But for now, as the wind howled and the last embers glowed, Irik's mind drifted far from fish and frost, sailing instead to warmer shores that waited only in the fragile cradle of his sleep. The days crept by like shadows over stone, slow yet unyielding. The sea remained their master, dictating the rhythm of hunger and hope with each tide that rose and fell against the jagged shore. In the village, every soul woke to the same dull ache of work, nets to mend, fish to salt, wood to split for the hearth. Even the children, with their quick fingers and keen eyes, found no idle hours to dream beneath the clouded sky. For Eric, the mornings began now not with sleep, but with quiet tasks set by his father. He learned to coil rope without knots, to scrape the hull clean of barnacles, to patch small leaks with tar warmed over coals. His hands, once soft and clumsy, grew raw and sure beneath the bite of salt and splinters. Each task was a small seed of manhood sown in the frost-hardened soil of his youth. One dusk, as the last catch of the day was hauled ashore, a commotion stirred at the edge of the village. A figure approached along the rocky path. An old man, bent at the spine, but cloaked in a fine wool that marked him as something more than another starving fisherman. He leaned heavily on a carved staff, the head of which bore runes worn smooth by years of travel and weather. The villagers fell silent as he passed, parting like reeds before a drifting log. They called him Hakon the Farseer, a skald and trader who drifted from settlement to settlement, carrying not only bits of news and foreign trinkets, but stories. Stories that bought him food and shelter when coins ran thin. He came only rarely, when the roads were clear enough to walk and the seas calm enough to cross in small craft. Leif greeted the old man with the quiet respect owed to one who carried the world on his shoulders. He offered him a seat by the hearth that night, a scrap of salted fish, and a horn of mead diluted thin with warm water. Eric sat cross-legged at Hakon's feet, eyes wide with questions he did not yet know how to shape into words. Hakon's voice was rough as old rope, yet his words flowed smooth as the mead. He spoke of ships that sailed farther than any in their small village had dreamed, of Frankish kings who wore crowns of hammered gold and drank wine that tasted of distant summers. He told of monks who hid silver in cold stone churches, praying for mercy when the dragon-proud ships darkened their shores. At these words, the men leaned in, for among the hardship there was always the whisper of plunder, the promise of a raid that might fill their coffers and bellies alike. Yet Hakon did not linger on raiding tales alone. He spoke, too, of hunger in other lands, of peasants who bowed before their lords yet starved beneath the weight of taxes, of storms that battered even the strongest walls and sicknesses that crept through stone keeps as easily as through timber huts. When the fire burned low, Hakon turned his cloudy eyes to Eirik and asked him if he feared the sea. Eirik felt his father's gaze upon him, heavy with a question older than either of them. He shook his head, though in truth his heart trembled each time he watched the boat slip into the gray vastness. Hakon only nodded, as if he saw the lie and forgave it. Before he slept that night, the old skald took a small pouch from the folds of his cloak. From it, he drew a single coin, strange and dark, stamped with the face of a foreign king. He pressed it into Eirik's palm, the metal cold and oddly heavy. "Keep it," Hakon rasped, his breath smelling of smoke and salt. A boy should carry something that reminds him the world is wider than his own hearth. Eirik turned the coin over and over as he lay beside the dying fire. He pictured the kingdoms Hakon spoke of, the warm lands where wheat grew tall and gold gleamed beneath the sun. He wondered if one day he might stand beneath those strange banners, if he would feel warmth that did not come from fire alone. Outside, the wind sang through the village, threading its cold fingers through the thatch and creaking the heavy doors. Freydis slept lightly, waking at every groan of timber. Leif sat awake for a long while, sharpening his fishing spear with slow, careful strokes, the sparks from the whetstone dancing like tiny stars. When morning returned, gray and unkind, the village rose again to meet it with bent backs and silent prayers. Hakon gathered his bundle and staff, pressing a hand to Leif's shoulder before he disappeared into the mist, bound for the next hearth that would warm his bones for a night. In the days that followed, Eirik kept the coin hidden in a fold of cloth near his chest. When the work grew too heavy or the hunger too sharp, he would slip it out and trace the strange face with his thumb. It glimmered like a promise that somewhere beyond the edge of the sea lay something softer than this hard, cold life, and that one day, perhaps, he might find it. The weeks slipped by as winter's grip began its slow, reluctant retreat. Snow still clung to the shaded hollows and drifted in ragged heaps against the longhouse walls. But in the afternoons, thin rivulets of meltwater carved dark veins through the frozen earth. To the villagers, these tiny streams were not just water. They were hope, whispering of soil that might soften enough for barley to take root once more. For Eirik, the passing of the harshest cold meant longer days at his father's side. Leif showed him how to patch the sails with coarse thread dipped in fish oil to keep the worst of the damp away. He taught him the proper knots for tethering the boat against the shifting tide, the subtle feel of a line tugged by something more than the restless current. One chill dawn, Eirik rose before the sun. He slipped from beneath the scratchy wool blanket, careful not to wake Freydis, who lay curled near the hearth. He crept past his mother's soft breathing, past the bundled furs where his younger sister snuffled in her sleep. Outside, the world was blue-gray and silent, save for the distant murmur of waves and the soft groan of ice breaking from the shoreline. He found Leif already at the water's edge, a dark shape bent over the nets. Frost rimed the old man's beard, and his breath plumed out in ghostly gusts. Eirik stepped beside him, wordless, and took hold of the dripping net without being asked. The rough rope bit into his palms, but he held tight, his small frame steady against the drag. They worked side by side, father and son, the only sounds the slap of water and the scrape of stone beneath their boots. When at last they hauled in the net, the reward was meager, 3 slender fish and a writhing knot of seaweed. Leif said nothing, only pressed a heavy hand to Eirik's shoulder. In that silence lay both pride and worry, a father's quiet fear that the sea might someday claim his boy as it had claimed so many before. As the sun broke over the horizon, its pale light found the village stirring to life. Smoke rose from chimneys, thin but promising warmth. Women stepped from their doorways, baskets at their hips, eyes scanning the tree line for the first brave sprigs of green. Children, Eirik among them when his father sent him home, were sent to gather driftwood washed ashore by the thawing tide. Down the narrow path that led into the hills behind the village, an older boy named Bjorn waited for Eirik. Bjorn was larger by 2 winters, his hair a wild nest of straw-blonde tangles. He grinned when he saw Eirik, showing a gap where a tooth had been knocked out in a rough game the previous spring. "Come," Bjorn said, jerking his chin toward the dark trees. "There's rabbit tracks. Maybe today the traps hold." Eirik hesitated, glancing back at the thin line of smoke rising from his own hearth. But the thought of warm meat, even a small bite, banished his worry. He followed Bjorn, their boots crunching through patches of old snow and brittle twigs. They moved quietly through the underbrush, eyes scanning for the telltale signs. A scatter of prints, a tuft of fur caught on a branch. Bjorn showed Eirik how to check the snares, loops of gut cord hidden beneath brush and leaves. They found the first trap empty, the bait stone cold and untouched. The second snare held only a snapped cord, the prey gone without a trace. At the third trap, Bjorn stopped so suddenly that Eirik nearly stumbled into him. There, half buried beneath dead leaves, a small rabbit kicked weakly, its leg caught tight in the snare. Its fur was matted with frost and mud, its eyes wide with panic. Bjorn reached for his knife, but Eirik stepped forward, his breath catching in his throat. He could feel the soft, frantic thrum of the animal's fear as he knelt beside it. For a moment, he saw his sister's tiny hands, her small ribs rising and falling in sleep beside the hearth. Life was so thin here, so easily snatched away. "Do it," Bjorn urged, impatience sharp in his voice. "We can trade the pelt. Your mother can cook the meat." Eirik's fingers hovered above the rabbit's trembling back. Then he looked away, his hands falling useless to his sides. Bjorn rolled his eyes, shoved him aside, and with a quick, practiced motion, ended the creature's struggle. The sudden stillness left the woods strangely loud with birdsong and the drip of melting snow. They trudged back to the village with their prize swinging from Bjorn's belt. Bjorn talked of how his father would praise him, how his mother might even save him a bit of fat to lick from the knife. Eirik said nothing, trailing behind, his hands buried deep in the folds of his tunic where the foreign coin pressed cold against his chest. When they reached the edge of the settlement, Freydis was waiting by the doorway. She looked first at Bjorn, then at the rabbit, then at her son's downturned face. She said nothing, only brushed the hair from Eirik's forehead and sent him to the hearth to warm his numb fingers. That night, the smell of rabbit stew drifted through the longhouse. They ate in silence, savoring the rare taste of meat, the way it clung to their tongues and reminded them, cruelly, of how empty the days could feel without it. Eirik chewed slowly, each bite a knot of guilt and hunger in his throat. Long after the bowls were scraped clean, he lay awake listening to the wind sigh through the chinks in the walls. His father's breathing was a steady rhythm beside the hearth, his mother's soft humming the only barrier against the cold. Beneath his blanket, Eirik held the coin tight, its face catching the flicker of the dying fire. He wondered if the kings on foreign shores ever lay awake at night, listening to the wind and dreaming of something softer than survival. He wondered if he would ever find out. And in the restless dark, the North reminded him, softly, cruelly, that dreams here were paid for dearly, often with more than a boy had to give. When spring at last made its hesitant promise, the village stirred like an old bear waking from restless sleep. The snow withdrew into shadowed gullies, leaving behind patches of brown earth and the brittle bones of last year's grass. Thin shoots of green pushed through the damp ground, trembling in the chill wind that still carried the bite of the northern sea. For Eirik, these first days of thaw brought new chores. No longer did he linger only by the boats and nets. Now his father took him to the small, rough fields behind the longhouses, where stones lay thick beneath the thawed soil. Here, men and boys bent their backs to the earth, prying up rocks with crude wooden spades and bare hands, casting them aside to clear just enough space for barley and hardy root vegetables to cling to life. Leif showed Eirik how to test the soil's readiness. Scoop a handful, squeeze it, watch how it crumbled between frost-chapped fingers. Too wet, and the seed would rot. Too dry, and it would starve before breaking through the dirt. There was no measure more precise than the old wisdom carried in calloused palms and weary eyes. As they worked, the village hummed with new, cautious hope. Women patched roofs torn by winter winds. Younger children darted between the huts, chasing each other with squeals that stirred smiles even on faces creased deep by hunger. From the forest came the occasional crack of a felled tree, firewood to dry for the next long winter, always looming just beyond the green. One afternoon, as the sun lingered longer than it had for many weeks, Eirik's father paused beside a crooked birch and pointed toward the distant ridge where the forest thickened into dark mystery. "Tomorrow," Leif said, his voice low and certain, "we'll hunt deer if the gods are kind. Come with me, Eric. You're old enough to see what it means to take meat from the land instead of the sea. Eric nodded, trying to hold back the tremor in his chest. He had never hunted more than rabbits, never felt the pull of a bowstring heavy with intent, nor seen blood steam on the cold ground from something larger than a trembling hair. That night, he hardly slept, listening to the soft scrape of his father sharpening the old hunting knife by the hearth. At dawn, they set out. The air smelled wet and clean, the forest floor slick with meltwater. Leaf moved ahead in silence, bough slung over his broad shoulders, steps light despite the years that weighted his bones. Eric mimicked each motion, stepping where his father stepped, ducking beneath the same low branches, wincing when the cold seeped through his worn boots. They climbed for hours, slipping through shadows and shafts of pale sun. At a ridge crowned by ancient pines, Leaf raised a hand and crouched. Eric stilled beside him, breath shallow, heart hammering like a drum against his ribs. Below, where the snow receded into the mossy hollows, a stag picked its way through the underbrush. Its antlers were velveted still, crowned by soft fuzz that would soon harden to sharp, regal tines. It moved with a grace that seemed almost mocking, untouched by the hunger that gnawed at the village below. Leaf unslung his bow, drawing the string until it creaked with strain. Eric watched the muscles in his father's arm tighten, the arrow's feathered end quivering in the cold air. He could feel his own breath catch, saw the slow exhale of the stag's life, warm and unaware. The string released with a soft snap. The arrow flew true, striking deep behind the stag's shoulder. It lurched, stumbled, and fled a few staggering steps before the strength bled from its limbs. When it fell, the forest fell silent around them, as if the old trees themselves held their breath in mourning. They approached slowly. Eric's eyes could not leave the animal. Its stillness seemed unreal, as if it might yet leap up and vanish into the pines. Leaf knelt, pressing a hand to the stag's flank. The old hunter murmured a quiet prayer, words of thanks to the land and the gods that watched from high, hidden halls. Then the knife was drawn, quick and sure. Eric turned away at first, but his father called him back, voice stern yet gentle. "Look, boy, if you will eat, you must know what it costs." So Eric knelt, breath misting in the cold dawn, and watched as the stag was opened. The warmth of its body steamed in the brittle air, a fleeting reminder that life here could be fierce and fleeting all at once. His father showed him how to cut cleanly, how to save the good meat, how to leave the rest for the wolves and ravens, the old pact that nothing in the north went wasted. They dragged the carcass home through the waking forest. Each step was heavy, but each step was a promise of full bellies for a little while. At the village edge, people gathered to watch them come. Freydis pressed her hands together in silent relief, eyes softening when she saw her son's flushed, exhausted face. That evening, smoke rose thick and fragrant from the hearths. Meat roasted over crackling fires, its scent drifting down the wind to where the sea sighed against the shore. Children laughed with full mouths for the first time in many nights. Old men sucked marrow from bones, eyes bright with memories of other hunts, other feasts. Eric sat by the flames, tasting the meat his hands had helped carry home. He chewed slowly, feeling its warmth seep into his bones, chasing away the deep ache of winter. But in the flicker of the firelight, his eyes strayed to the coin he kept hidden near his chest, a quiet reminder that beyond this hard, brutal plenty lay other lands, other dreams. And though the meat filled his belly, it did not quiet the restless hunger that curled like smoke in the corners of his mind. The warmth of the deer lingered for days, seeping into every corner of the village like a fragile promise that hunger might be held at bay, if only for a little while. Smoke from the cook fires wove lazy ribbons through the thatched rooftops, and for once, laughter mingled with the crackle of flames rather than the hollow cough of empty stomachs. Freydis dried strips of meat above the hearth, threading them with care so they would last through the lean days, sure to come again. She hummed her old songs as she worked, the notes drifting up into the rafters where last year's herbs still clung, brittle and dusty. Eric watched her fingers, nimble and patient, binding the thin cords that would keep the meat safe from damp and mice. He marveled at how even in small moments his mother's hands seemed to hold the whole family together. With bellies full, the village turned once more to its endless cycle of mending and making ready. Leif took Eirik to the small stony plot they called a field. There, he showed him how to scatter the barley seed, tossing it wide with a careful swing of the arm so it fell like a whisper across the thawed soil. The grain looked so small in the cold earth, fragile specks that held a whole season's hope within their pale husks. Each seed, Leif said, his voice low as they worked side by side, is a promise to the ground and to the gods. We give it over, and they decide whether we feast or starve. Eirik nodded, though the weight of it settled like a stone in his chest. He wondered if the kings Hakon spoke of ever knelt in dirt, fingers numb from the cold, whispering silent pleas to hidden gods for a single good harvest. In the evenings, when the fields were quiet and the nets pulled in for the night, the villagers gathered around flickering fires. Old tales flowed as freely as the thin ale they brewed from leftover grain. One night, Bjorn's father, Sten, spoke of his youth, of a raid far to the west where the sun was warm even in winter and the churches shone with silver crosses that glittered like captured starlight. He told of ships drawn up on foreign sand, of iron swords raised against men who had never held a blade in anger. The children sat wide-eyed as he described the strange foods they found there. Sweet cakes, wheels of cheese soft as butter, fruit that tasted of sun and rain. For a heartbeat, the longhouse seemed larger, brighter, as if the warmth of that distant land flickered among the shadows. Bjorn grinned across the fire at Eirik, his missing tooth a dark gap in the dance of light. Someday, he boasted, I'll stand on those shores myself. I'll come home with silver rings on every finger and a cloak of silk the color of the setting sun. The men chuckled, some shaking their heads, others nodding, as if they too tasted salt spray on distant waves. Leif only watched Eirik quietly, his eyes dark and deep. When the laughter faded and the embers glowed low, father and son walked back to their longhouse beneath a cold, clear sky. That night, sleep did not come easily to Eirik. He lay wrapped in his rough blanket, listening to the hush of waves against the rocks and the soft murmur of his mother's voice as she settled his sister for the night. He slipped a hand beneath his tunic and touched the coin, its edge smooth against his skin. He imagined himself on a ship, a dragon-headed prow cutting through green waters. The sail billowed full by wind that smelled not of salt and rot, but of promise. He saw cities of stone, towers rising so high they scraped the belly of the sky, streets crowded with people whose tongues curled around words he did not know but longed to speak. Yet when he closed his eyes, the dream blurred with the cold truth that tomorrow he would wake before dawn. There would be more stones to clear from the field, more nets to mend, more fish to gut and hang to dry. The world beyond the sea felt vast and bright in his mind, but the north held him close with rough hands and breath that smelled of smoke and snow. As the fire in the hearth crackled down to its final coals, Eirik wondered if he would ever break free of the land that claimed him. He did not fear the storms or the dark waves. He feared only that he might never stand at the bow of his own ship, never see if the coin's promise was real. In his half-sleep, he heard his father's voice murmuring to Freydis, low, so as not to wake the children. They spoke of the hunt, of the field, of the next winter, always waiting behind the coming summer's thin warmth. Even when the wind rattled the shutters and the old beams sighed, that quiet talk held the house together, a fragile bond of hope against the unyielding dark. When dawn crept in again, pale and watchful, Eirik rose before the sun, as he always did. He slipped the coin into its hiding place, tied his boots with fingers stiff from cold, and stepped out into the thin light. The fields waited. The sea waited. And somewhere far beyond, the world he dreamed of waited too, patient as the tide and just as hard to reach. The days lengthened, though warmth remained a fickle visitor, drifting in on soft breezes, only to be chased away again by sudden squalls from the sea. Each dawn found the villagers bent to their labor, mending, planting, hauling, always in motion, for rest was a luxury they could ill afford. Eirik worked beside his father in the barley field until his back ached and his fingers were raw with cold soil and rough stalks. When they returned to the village at dusk, their boots heavy with mud, they found Freydis bent over the hearth, stirring a pot of thin porridge sweetened with the last scrapings of dried berries from the previous summer. She greeted them with a tired smile, her eyes softening at the sight of her son's hunched shoulders and grimy hands. One evening, as Eric sat by the door, scraping dirt from his boots, he heard voices raised down by the shore. He stood quickly, curiosity sparking through the dull ache of his limbs. He could see a gathering of men at the water's edge, their shapes dark against the pale wash of twilight. Among them, a new boat bobbed in the shallows, larger than any in the village, its hull painted with curling lines of red and black that caught the last of the sinking sun. Life appeared at his side, following his son's gaze. "That's Jarl Rurik's ship," he murmured, his voice caught somewhere between worry and resignation. Eirik felt his chest tighten at the name. The Jarl was no king, yet in this scatter of coastal farms and fishing hamlets, his word carried weight sharper than any blade. Together, father and son walked down to the shore where the villagers gathered in cautious clusters. Jarl Rurik stood at the prow of his boat, broad-shouldered and clad in a heavy wool cloak pinned with a bronze brooch. His beard was flecked with gray, and his eyes, pale as sea ice, swept over the people as though measuring them for worth or weakness. Beside him stood two of his men, younger but hardened by travel and salt wind. Their boots were caked in foreign mud, and their belts bristled with knives and axes, too fine to be forged in this poor village. When the murmur of the crowd died, Rurik raised a hand. His voice rolled out, calm and steady, but carrying the same chill as the sea behind him. "Good folk, the time comes again when we must look beyond our own shores. Summer will bring no easy harvest, not in these thin fields. So we look west, to the fat lands, the soft lands, where gold lies waiting for men with courage enough to claim it." A ripple ran through the gathered villagers. Part fear, part hunger, part the restless thrill that always stirred when talk of raiding rose among lean-bellied men. Eric felt Bjorn step up beside him, breathless, eyes bright as he whispered, "This is it, Eirik. They'll take some of us. Maybe they'll take us both." Leif's hand closed tight around Eric's shoulder. He could feel the worry in his father's grip, the old ache of a man who had once sailed west and come back changed, a man who knew that silver spilled from foreign churches came at a cost measured not only in blood, but in souls left behind to wonder if the waves would ever return what they took. Rurik's men began to move among the villagers, speaking low, asking who could sail, who could hold a shield, who could swing an axe and stand firm when arrows fell like rain. Young men stepped forward eagerly, Bjorn among the first, puffed up with dreams of loot and glory. Fathers stood back, weighing the promise of silver against the loss of strong backs for the planting season. Mothers held younger sons close, murmuring prayers to gods who seldom answered. When one of Rurik's men reached Leif, his pale eyes flicked to Eirik. "How old is this one?" he asked, voice flat as a blade. Leif's jaw tightened. "Too young to swing a sword, old enough to mend nets," Leif said. His tone was calm, but held an edge that told the man to move on. The warrior's eyes lingered on Eirik a heartbeat longer. Then he turned away, his boots crunching over the pebbled shore. That night, the longhouses hummed with restless talk. Fires burned low as families argued in hushed voices, some eager for the silver and the stories, others fearing the empty beds and cold hearths left behind. Eirik sat near the hearth, the warmth of the deer meat already a memory. He fingered the coin Hakon had given him, its strange face cold and smooth against the grime on his palms. He pictured himself at Bjorn's side, the salt wind tearing at his hair as they stood at the prow of a great ship bound for shores, where fruit grew heavy on the bow and silver gleamed behind wooden doors. He could almost hear the clash of iron, the roar of waves against the hull. But beneath that dream lurked the chill memory of his brother Nut, who had sailed west once and never returned. Freydis touched his shoulder gently, her thumb brushing the dirt from his cheek. "Sleep now, my son," she whispered, though her voice carried the weight of a mother's fear that the sea which gave so little might yet take what little she had left. Long after his parents drifted into uneasy sleep, Eirik lay awake by the hearth's dying glow. He could hear Bjorn's voice still, bright with reckless hope. He could hear the sea, too, murmuring beyond the dark dunes, an endless song of hunger and promise, calling him to a world both wider and more brutal than this hard scrap of northern earth. Morning rose heavy and gray over the village, A damp hush settled on the rooftops where mist clung like old regrets. The gulls wheeled low over the tide, their harsh cries mingling with the dull clank of oars and the murmur of voices near the Jarl's boat. By first light, the small cove had become a makeshift muster ground, men and boys lingering at the water's edge, torn between longing and dread. Inside the longhouse, Eric's mother moved through the dawn with quiet purpose. She laid a hand on her son's shoulder as he pulled on his rough tunic, her fingers pausing at the hidden shape of the coin beneath the fabric. She did not ask about it. She had seen it enough times caught in the flicker of the hearth, but her thumb brushed the spot as if by touch alone she could keep her boy anchored here, on this strip of cold earth that still claimed him. Outside, Leaf waited, shoulders hunched against the cold, eyes shadowed by sleepless worry. He watched Eric with a look that said all he would not speak aloud, that a father's pride and fear were two threads woven so tightly they could never be pulled apart. They walked together to the shore where Rurik's ship bobbed against the pull of the tide. The Jarl stood near the prow again, conferring with his men. Around him, boys only a few winters older than Eirik boasted in eager bursts, Bjorn loudest among them, slapping backs and tracing shapes in the air with his hands as he bragged of gold and glory. When Bjorn saw Eirik, he grinned wide, the gap in his teeth showing like a badge of rough courage. Today's the day, Eirik. They'll take me for sure. Maybe they'll take you too. We'll stand side by side, fight, plunder, come back kings. Eirik tried to mirror his friend's grin, but his smile faltered when he caught his father's eyes. Leif stepped forward then, placing a firm hand on Bjorn's shoulder. "Mind your tongue, boy," he said, not unkindly. King or corpse, they look the same to the sea when the waves turn cruel. Bjorn shrugged off the words with the reckless ease of youth. He turned back to the cluster of older boys who laughed and jostled by the ship's gangplank. Rurik's voice cut through the morning hush, steady and cold as a winter gust. "We sail with the turning tide. 2 hands for every oar, 2 more for the shield wall. If you stand here and swear you are ready, you are bound to the voyage." One by one, they stepped forward, Bjorn first, eyes bright as steel, newly polished. He spat in his palm and pressed it to the rough wood of the ship's rail, a promise given not just to Rurik, but to the restless sea itself. Others followed, some with trembling hands, others with laughter too loud to hide the quake beneath. When the line thinned, Eirik felt his own feet pull him forward. The dream of far-off shores tugged at him, the taste of warm fruit, the soft promise of lands where life did not cling so tight to the edge of hunger. He felt the weight of the coin through his tunic, the foreign face pressed cold to his heart. But before he could move another step, Leif's hand closed around his wrist. No words were spoken. They did not need to be. The old fisherman's grip was firm, not cruel, but strong enough to remind Eirik that boyhood, for now, was still stronger than any dream of distant gold. Rurik's pale eyes flicked over to them, unreadable as tidewater. He gave a short nod, as if marking Eirik for some later day when the sea would claim him in its own time. Then he turned away, his voice rising to bark orders at the chosen few. Bjorn caught Eirik's gaze one last time before he climbed aboard. He tried to grin, but something in his eyes flickered, a boy's bravado frayed by the sharp edge of truth. Then he vanished up the gangplank, swallowed by the creak of the ship and the chant of oarsmen readying for the tide. As the longboat slipped from the shallows, the village gathered at the shore. Wives and mothers clutching shawls tight, fathers squinting at the gray horizon, children staring with wide eyes at the dragon-head prow that seemed to snarl at the rising sun. Leif stood silent beside his son, his breath a thin mist drifting out over the salt wind. Eirik felt the cold settle into his chest, heavier than before. He watched the dark shape of the ship grow small against the morning light, its sails swelling with promise and peril in equal measure. When it was only a shadow on the far water, Leif spoke at last. "There is bravery in staying, too," he said, so low Eirik almost missed it. "Not all who leave return, and not all who stay are cowards." They turned from the shore then, the hush of the waves at their backs, the taste of salt lingering on their lips like a ghost of something lost, or perhaps something yet to come. In the hush of that long walk back to the village, Eirik's mind drifted again to the coin hidden against his skin, to Bjorn's grin fading into the mist, to the restless whisper of the sea that never truly released those who listened too closely to its call. In the days that followed, the hush that settled over the village was thicker than the sea mist rolling in at dawn. The ship that carried Bjorn and the others westward had left behind not just a wake upon the gray water, but a hollow in the rhythm of life. A hush where once laughter and boasts had filled the evenings by the hearth. Eirik woke each morning before the sun, the taste of salt still clinging to his dreams. He helped his father mend nets by the cold surf and turned the damp soil behind the longhouse with a stubborn patience that belied the restlessness coiled tight in his chest. Each stone he pried from the earth seemed to echo with the memory of Bjorn's last grin, bright, eager, and edged with something Eirik now understood was fear. Freydis watched her son closely in those days, her sharp eyes catching every moment his gaze drifted out past the waves, every time his hand strayed to the hidden coin beneath his tunic. She spoke little of the ship or the boys who had sailed with Rurik. Instead, she taught Eric's sister to weave narrow bands of cloth, humming softly so the house would not feel so hollow. At night, when the wind rattled the thatch and the fire burned low, Leif would sometimes sit with his son and speak of things Eric half understood, of years when he too had answered the sea's call, when his hands had gripped an oar until the salt cracked his skin and his eyes had burned from the sting of spray and smoke. He spoke of a monastery on a cold green isle, of silver crosses ripped from stone walls, of monks whose eyes were wide with terror, but who whispered prayers to a god who did not live in these lands of frost and pine. And he spoke of the voyage home, of the dead laid beneath the waves when storms rose so sudden and fierce that even the strongest warriors wept into their beards. Every piece of silver, Leif murmured one night, his voice a ragged thread, was bought with more than iron and blood. We left pieces of ourselves behind, scattered in the sea and buried in foreign soil. Some wounds never heal, Eirik, not even when the silver is long spent. His words drifted into the dark as Eirik lay awake, staring at the flickering shadows cast by the hearth's dying glow. He wondered if Bjorn felt the same fear now, his stomach turning with each swell of the waves beneath that dragon-headed prow. Yet when dawn came again, the world offered no time for such thoughts. Spring's thaw meant new work, stakes to drive into the earth for beans to climb, fish traps to sink into the shallows where the tide carried herring close enough to catch by hand. Leif showed Eirik how to twist willow branches into sturdy traps, weaving them tight so no fish could slip through. They set them in the frigid water together, their boots sinking into the mud, their fingers numb but sure. One afternoon, as the traps soaked in the slow tide, Eirik slipped away along the shore. He climbed the low rocky bluff that rose above the cove, a place where the wind always seemed sharper, biting at his cheeks and tugging at his hair like impatient fingers. From there, he could see far out over the endless gray, where the sea merged with the pale sky in a line so thin it seemed to tremble like a thought half remembered. He pulled the coin from its hiding place, turning it over and over in his palm. The face stamped into its dark metal caught the shifting light, the foreign king staring back at him with an expression he could not read, stern, distant, perhaps indifferent to the dreams of a boy standing on a lonely shore. Below, the village carried on. Smoke rose from hearths, mothers called children home from play, and gulls wheeled overhead, crying their harsh songs. Eirik wondered if any of those cries might carry far enough to reach Bjorn, wherever he was now, whether his ship still rode the waves or huddled in the lee of some foreign shore. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of brine and old kelp. Eirik closed his hand around the coin until the cold edge bit into his skin. He thought of his father's words, of wounds that never healed, and silver that could not feed an empty stomach forever. He thought, too, of his mother's quiet songs, her careful hands that made rough cloth strong enough to last through seasons of wear. When at last he climbed down from the bluff, the tide was retreating, leaving behind pools glittering with trapped fish and seaweed. Eirik squatted at the water's edge and watched a tiny silver fish dart beneath a drift of kelp. He caught it with quick fingers, feeling its slick, frantic life twist against his palm before he let it slip back into the cold shallows. That night, As the wind rose and rattled the shutters, Eric lay awake, listening for something he could not name. A voice in the dark, a whisper beneath the roar of the sea. He did not know if it was the promise of distant shores or the call of home that stirred in his chest. Only that it was there, restless as the tide, waiting for a day when the coin in his hand would find its purpose at last. In the deep hush of the northern twilight, when the winds of the fjords turned cold and the sun's last embers kissed the ragged crests of snow-laden hills, the Vikings gathered in their longhouses. The hearth crackled in the vast wooden hall, its warmth a slender mercy against the bitter breath of the North Sea. Here, inside these timbered walls, tales were woven thick as the furs on their backs, yet the truths behind their daily lives were not always the stuff of song and glory. For the saga of the Norsemen was written not only in raids and riches, but also in the quiet, gnawing hardships that clung to them like frost to their beards. As winter deepened, the ocean froze at the edges, and the fishing boats, so vital to their survival, sat trapped in ice. Men who had spent their summers plundering distant shores now found themselves humbled by empty nets and meager stores. Salted fish and dried meats hung from the rafters, but even these would dwindle before the thaw returned. It was not uncommon for a family to gather around the fire with bowls near empty, whispering small prayers to the old gods that the stores would last, that the sea would soon loosen its icy grip. The women, cloaked in woolen shawls, labored ceaselessly through the long, dark months. By flickering lamplight, they spun flax and wool into threads, weaving cloth thick enough to guard against the howling wind. Their fingers, cracked and raw from the cold, moved in quiet rhythm, one of the few gentle sounds in the otherwise harsh hush of the Viking homestead. Children, bundled tight in furs, huddled close to their mothers, learning to mend clothes and carve simple toys from bone and driftwood, the shadows of their play long against the timbered walls. Outside, the world seemed to sleep beneath layers of snow and silence, but danger did not sleep. Wolves prowled near the outskirts of villages, driven by hunger as relentless as that of the humans within. At night, farmers would wake to the mournful cry of livestock dragged from their pens, the dark red smear across the snow a grim reminder of the balance struck between man and nature. It was a savage pact. Survival for one meant loss for another. Yet, the fiercest battles were not always fought against beasts or the cruel sea, but rather within the heart. A man who could sail to foreign kingdoms and swing his axe with fearsome strength might find himself powerless when famine came. Pride did not fill the belly. Many who returned from raids with silver and fine spoils would trade these treasures for grain and salted herring, understanding too well that gold had little use when the cupboards were bare. Hunger made equals of warriors and thralls alike, and in this, the cold was a ruthless teacher. Still, life pushed forward through hardship. Feasts were planned carefully, reserved for the rare occasions when a hunt was good, or a trade ship brought unexpected bounty. Then, for a single night, the longhouse would ring with laughter and song, the warmth of mead and roasted meat fending off the long shadow of scarcity. Elders would tell stories of ancient kings and gods, their voices rising and falling with the embers in the hearth, planting dreams of spring in the minds of the weary. Even then, beneath the revelry, lay the quiet knowledge that tomorrow might be harsh again. One frost too many could ruin a harvest. An unexpected storm could splinter a ship and drown its crew. There were no certainties, only the resilience passed from one generation to the next, a deep, stubborn root that clung to the rocky soil of the north. Young men who dreamed of distant raids knew that the treasures they sought were not just for glory but for survival. Silver and slaves were wealth, but so were iron tools, sturdy ships, and alliances forged in the mead hall. In these frozen lands, nothing could be wasted. Every axe head, every scrap of hide, every morsel of dried cod was accounted for. Waste was not a luxury the Vikings could afford. And so they endured. Each harsh winter burned away the weak, but those who survived emerged hardened like iron left in the blacksmith's forge. They carried the lessons of famine and frost within their bones, wearing them like invisible armor when they sailed for foreign shores. The fearsome image the world came to know, the horn-helmed raiders, the dragon-prowed longships, was built upon a foundation of these hidden struggles, The daily war with an unforgiving land that shaped them into something both brutal and enduring. As the fire dimmed and the wind howled against the timber walls, the Vikings wrapped themselves in bearskins and whispered to the gods of the wind and sea. They prayed for gentle weather, for strong suns and fertile fields, for fish in their nets and safe passage across the waves. And if the gods remained silent, as they often did, the Vikings would face the dawn just the same, axes sharpened, sails ready, hearts steeled by the long, cold night. In that quiet resilience lay the true saga of the Northmen, a tale not only of raids and kingdoms won, but of countless nights survived by the smallest of mercies, a warm hearth, a loyal hound at one's feet, the promise of a spring that might come at last. When at last the ice began to loosen its grip, and the rivers stirred with the hush of moving water, a restless hope took root within the hearts of the Viking folk. The thaw came not with gentle warmth, but with sudden floods that swallowed fields and paths. Yet even this wild tumult was a herald of life returning to the land. Men and women emerged from their timbered dwellings like seeds from husks, blinking against the pale light of a reluctant sun. It was in these first days of the thaw that the Viking homesteads seemed most fragile. Food stores, carefully rationed through the dark months, now hovered at their lowest. The salted fish was down to brittle scraps, the barley bins swept clean of all but husks and weevils. Children peered into empty sacks, stomachs rumbling, and mothers measured out the last handfuls with grave care. There was no turning back to the shelter of winter's hibernation. Now they had only forward to look. And so, with hunger in their bellies but a spark of promise in their chests, they set about coaxing life from the thawing earth. Fields that had slumbered under drifts of snow were now trampled by boots and hooves as men turned the soil with heavy iron plows. It was hard work, back-breaking and slow, for the land in the north was often stony and reluctant to yield. Stones were pried from furrows with calloused hands, piled in neat walls that marked the edges of each family's hope for the harvest to come. The young ones ran barefoot through the mud, chasing crows from the seeds and scattering their laughter across the damp breeze. Yet even this play served purpose, for every frightened crow meant a few more grains left undisturbed to sprout. Dogs barked and nipped at heels, loyal guardians of the scattered flocks that would soon graze on new shoots of grass. Every life depended upon the fragile green blades that pushed their way toward the sun. The old men and women, their spines bent like wind-shaped trees, tended to the kitchen gardens near the longhouse walls. They buried onion sets and cabbage sprouts, herbs for flavor and medicine alike. They spoke to the plants as they worked, muttering half prayers and half memories of seasons past when the crops were good and the winter that followed was kinder for it. Beyond the homesteads, the fjords came alive with the creak of boats sliding back into water. Shipwrights, who had spent the darkest days mending hulls and tar-pitching seams by the hearth, now watched their craft bob and sway at the shore. Young men, lean from months of short rations, tested the oars with calloused palms, dreaming of fish to catch and coasts to raid. To fish was the first necessity, to raid the bolder gamble. Both were carved from the same need. Eager eyes turned toward the sea, for in its depths lay salvation or ruin. Cod and herring, mackerel and flatfish, these silver shoals were as valuable as gold, for they promised full bellies and salted stores for the winter yet to come. But the sea was never freely given. Storms still prowled the horizon, and a sudden squall could swallow a small fishing skiff with no more ceremony than a man crushing an eggshell in his fist. Yet the Vikings were no strangers to these perils. They trusted their long, narrow boats, built sturdy and swift, designed to cut through the icy chop like a knife through thick wool. Fathers passed down the secrets of the tides to sons, teaching them how to read the gull's cry, the ripple of fish beneath a slate-gray sky. Nets were cast, baited hooks dropped into the deep, and the sea returned what it would, no more, no less. In the evenings, when the light lingered just a moment longer than the night before, families gathered once more by the hearth. Stories flowed like the thawing streams outside, tales of long-ago kings, of sea serpents that curled beneath the waves, of spirits that guarded the forests and watched the sowing of fields. Children listened with wide eyes, lulled by the cadence of voices that carried the weight of old wisdom and quiet hope. It was in these quiet moments that the true shape of Viking life revealed itself. Not merely the brutal clash of sword and shield, but the soft, unyielding faith that tomorrow could be coaxed into being. The land was harsh, the sea cruel, yet each spring brought the chance to try again, to plant, to fish, to mend what had broken, and to believe that the coming harvest would stand between them and the slow gnaw of winter hunger. Under the same roof, neighbors gathered to help one another. If one man's net came back empty, another would share his catch, for none could stand alone against the raw edge of the north. Feuds and rivalries slept for a while, buried under the shared labor of survival. For all their fierce independence, the Vikings knew that the bond of kin and neighbor was a shield stronger than any iron-forged blade. When at last the first shoots broke through the dark soil and the fish began to fill the boats, a quiet gladness settled upon the village. It was not triumph in the manner of conquering armies or plundered kingdoms, but something far more vital, a small victory over the hunger that haunted every hearth. Women sang as they cooked the first fresh stew of the season, men laughed as they mended sails for longer journeys, and children ran barefoot through the fields, chasing the sun that now lingered just a bit longer in the northern sky. And so the cycle turned once more. The Vikings, bound by the unrelenting seasons, knew their hardships were never truly over, merely softened by the warmth of spring and the promise of what might grow from seed and salt alike. In this fragile hope, they found their strength, hidden not in raids or gold, but in the quiet, enduring will to survive another year beneath the restless northern sky. As spring unfurled its pale green fingers across the Norse lands, the Vikings turned their eyes once more to the restless sea, that vast, shifting road which promised fortune and ruin in equal measure. With the rivers thawed and the fjords alive with the calls of seabirds, the longships, those slender wooden beasts that had slept beneath tarpaulins all winter, were slid from their cradles of stone and earth back into the cold embrace of salt water. Men gathered along the shores at dawn, their breath misting in the crisp air as they checked hulls for cracks and sails for rot. Every timber was precious. Oak for strength, pine for pliancy, iron nails hammered home with care. Children clambered over the dragon-headed prows, tracing the fierce carvings with stubby fingers, imagining adventures that might one day be theirs when they too were old enough to grip an oar or swing a blade. The village hummed with a fevered energy, a mixture of dread and excitement. For while the sea could give, it could just as easily take, and each man who stepped onto a ship knew well the tales of brothers lost to storms, to enemy blades, or to the deep, indifferent cold that swallowed men without a trace. Yet the hunger that winter left behind was a more certain enemy still. The choice was simple, and so it was made year after year. When the ice broke, the sails rose. Some ships set out for fishing grounds close to home, where cod and herring shoals glittered beneath the shifting light. Others, bolder and fewer in number, were outfitted for longer journeys, raids, trade, or both. Wordless understanding passed between the elders who stood watching from the shore. Some of these ships would not return before the next snow, and some would never return at all. But fear was not something to be spoken of openly. Instead, it lived in small gestures. A wife tucking a lucky charm into her husband's pack, a mother pressing a carved rune into her son's palm, a whispered prayer to Aegir, the god of the sea, to keep the waves gentle and the winds kind. The ships pushed off with a chorus of splashing oars, the dragon heads cutting across the water like living things. Back on land, life pressed forward, though the absence of fathers and brothers left the longhouses feeling cavernous and still. The women shouldered what burdens they could, tending flocks, mending fences battered by winter's storms, seeing that the barley sprouted true in the fields. If the winds turned warm and the sun held its course, the harvest might come early, and the burden of lean months could be lifted more easily from narrow shoulders. Children found mischief where they could, helping herd the sheep up the hillsides where the grass grew fresh and sweet, gathering eggs from the wild nests hidden among heather and bramble. Their laughter floated across the valley, small echoes of the life that stubbornly clung to this unforgiving land. Each giggle, each footstep through wet grass was a quiet rebellion against the harshness that waited on the edge of every season. evenings brought their own rituals. With the men gone, the women gathered together after the day's work was done, spinning wool, patching cloaks, and telling stories to keep the younger ones close and quiet. Flames flickered in the hearth, shadows danced across the carved beams overhead, and old tales rose like smoke into the rafters. Stories of gods and monsters, of wise kings and cunning shield maidens who outwitted enemies twice their strength. For in these stories lay not just entertainment, but reminders, lessons buried in the fabric of myth. The young ones were taught through whispered sagas that bravery was not the absence of fear, but the choice to stand against it, that cleverness and endurance could carry one farther than brute strength alone, and that the gods, though powerful, were as capricious as the sea, best respected but never fully trusted. In hidden corners, some few kept their own counsel, speaking soft words to the old spirits, those older than Odin, older even than the carved gods of stone and bone. They left small offerings beneath ancient trees or at quiet streams, bits of bread or precious drops of honey, hoping these forgotten guardians might lend their blessing where the newer gods sometimes turned a deaf ear. Meanwhile, out upon the restless waves, the long ships rode the swells, their sails catching the spring winds like the wings of great seabirds. The men aboard slept little and dreamed even less, their minds fixed on distant shores, on villages that might yield silver and grain, or foreign traders who might barter silk for amber, wine for iron. Every splash of salt spray on their faces reminded them of what lay at stake. If they returned, they would come bearing riches enough to see their kin through the next winter. If they did not, then their names would live on only in the songs sung by the hearth. In this way, the days stretched on, land and sea, toil and risk, hope and loss woven tightly together, like the threads on a loom. Each dawn brought another chance for the soil to warm, for the nets to fill, for the sails to carry their fathers safely home. And when night fell, the sky above the fjords shimmered with stars so bright they seemed like sparks drifting from the god's own forge, tiny beacons reminding all below that life, though harsh, was not without its quiet wonders. So they endured. They waited, and they worked, they sang, and they prayed. They hoped in silence and wept in private when the waiting grew too long. And always, they listened for the distant sound of oars cutting through the fjord's dark water, a sound that meant a ship was coming home, and with it, another heartbeat to carry them through the brutal beauty of their northern world. It was in the slow, lengthening days of early summer that the Vikings' true test of endurance revealed itself not in battle cries or storms at sea, but in the quiet, unrelenting labor that bound their lives together like the strands of a thick rope. Now the land was awake, the sun riding high above the green hills for long hours that seemed to stretch into the deepest corners of the night. The shadows that once devoured the villages in endless winter now shrank before the pale northern light. In these months, every able hand found its task. Fields rippled with new barley, its slender stalks whispering secrets to the wind as they grew toward the ever-watchful sun. Women bent low among the rows, weeding, tending, coaxing the fragile green into sturdy gold that would fill their storehouses if the weather stayed kind. The older children ran between them, shooing birds and gathering wild herbs for the stew pots that never seemed quite full enough. Beyond the tilled fields lay the meadows, where sheep and goats grazed under the watchful eyes of young boys and girls. Their laughter rose like birdsong over the hum of bees drifting from flower to flower. The flocks were wealth too, though in a different coin. Wool for warmth, milk for butter and cheese, meat only when the seasons turned lean and left no other choice. Each ewe or nanny goat was precious, her life guarded with vigilance, for the loss of even one could mean a winter night colder and a pot emptier than any tale of glory could mend. Near the edges of the villages, blacksmiths and carpenters toiled in sheds and open yards. Sparks danced from the anvils as iron was shaped into plowshares, nails, and spearheads. The rhythmic clang of hammer on metal rang through the long hours like a heartbeat, a reminder that though the sea brought wealth, it was the land and the hands of its people that truly forged survival. Saws bit into oak and pine, shaping timbers for new ships or mending the old. Always the ships, for the Vikings' restless spirit could no more stay beached than the sea could lie still. Inside the longhouses, the weaving looms sang their wooden songs. Women and older girls worked wool into yarn, yarn into cloth, cloth into tunics and cloaks to wrap the family against the winds that would return all too soon. Each piece of fabric held hours of patient labor, each stitch a prayer against the biting cold of a future that never failed to come. At the heart of every homestead stood the hearth, its stones blackened by countless seasons of smoke and flame. Here the families gathered at day's end, their skin warm from the sun, but their bones weary from honest toil. Bowls of thin broth and fresh bread passed from hand to hand, each bite earned and cherished. Small stories drifted over the food, of mischief among the goats, of a fishing boat that returned heavy with catch, of a neighbor who had glimpsed seals playing near the fjord, an omen some believed to be a blessing. But even in these gentle hours, the undercurrent of hardship never drifted far. Every smile knew its weight. A single drought or sudden storm could flatten a field of barley in an afternoon, leaving hunger where hope had stood just days before. Illness, too, lurked like a wolf at the door, an infected wound from a smith's chisel, a fever that clung stubbornly to a child's breath, a birthing that ended with a mother's soft cry and silence in her place. Yet it was not in their nature to flinch from such truths. Instead, the Vikings turned hardship into story, fear into firelight. When the sun dipped low but refused to vanish entirely, when dusk lingered in shades of gold and gray, the elders would gather the children near. They spoke of the old gods, of Freyr, whose blessings ripened the fields, of Thor, whose hammer broke the storms, of cunning Loki, whose tricks reminded all that fortune could shift like wind on open water. These stories did not shield the people from hunger or cold, but they lent meaning to suffering, gave it shape and purpose. In the telling, hardship became something to bear together, not alone. A child who woke weeping in the night for want of his father's voice might sleep again under the whisper of a saga older than the stones beneath the hearth. Sometimes, too, the talk turned to the men at sea. Mothers dreamed by the fire of sons who would return with silver arm rings and bolts of colored cloth, with spices that smelled of warm lands far beyond the cold horizon. Wives touched the edges of empty sleeping places and let hope keep them warm where furs could not. In those moments, the crackle of the hearth and the hush of the wind outside the door were one, soft reminders that life was ever a balance between waiting and doing, between what the sea took and what it gave back. So the days passed, each one strung upon the thread of the sun's slow arc across the sky. The Vikings rose with the dawn, worked through the full reach of daylight, and laid down their heads only when the last chores were done and the embers in the hearth glowed low and steady. In the quiet that came then, when the children slept, the sheep dozed in their pens, and the fields rested beneath the watchful stars, the people of the North dreamt not just of raids or riches, but of harvests that would stand strong against winter's return. In that dreaming, they found a kind of peace. Not the soft, gentle peace of sheltered kingdoms far to the south, but the hard, honest peace born of hands worn raw, of backs bent to the soil, of hearts that refused to bow to the long, brutal years that lay behind them, and the harsher ones yet to come. And always in the distance, the sea whispered its promises, silver fish, foreign gold, distant shores waiting beneath the horizon's curve. It was a song both cruel and sweet, and it called them on, season after season, into the restless dark. As the days stretched deeper into summer, and the sun lingered almost endlessly above the rugged peaks and winding fjords, the Viking settlements seemed to hold their breath in a strange hush between toil and waiting. For though the fields were green and the livestock fattened under the warmth, a restless yearning always stirred beneath the calm surface of village life. It was in the beating of hammers, the creak of looms, the quiet murmur of prayers uttered while hands pulled weeds from stubborn earth. And it was strongest in the hearts of those who stood at the water's edge, searching the horizon for sails that might return, or might not. At night, the northern sky refused full darkness, painted instead in deep shades of twilight blue and muted gold that shimmered across still waters. The rivers, once frozen and silent, now ran fast and clear, carrying the promise of distant mountains down to the fjords, where longships might soon appear like ghostly shapes out of the haze. The old men and women said, You could sometimes smell the sea before you saw the ships, a salt tang that drifted into the valleys on a warm breeze, stirring hope and dread in equal measure. For those who waited on shore, the passing days brought the slow erosion of patience. Each dawn began with eyes turned eastward, squinting into the low light, searching for the curve of a sail against the endless sweep of sky. Children asked too many questions. When would father come home? Would he bring beads or honey cakes or stories of kings? Mothers hushed them gently, turning their faces away so the little ones would not see the worry that pooled like shadow in the corners of their eyes. When a sail was finally spotted, one bright morning when the air tasted of salt and the gulls wheeled in sudden frantic circles, it did not matter who saw it first. Word spread like fire across the village. Fields were abandoned mid-weeding, looms left half-threaded, goats untended for a few precious moments. Men and women alike gathered at the rocky shore, hearts drumming in their chests like war drums, throats tight with 1,000 unspoken questions. The ship that came gliding home was lean and long, its dragon-headed prow cutting the fjord's glassy surface with a grace that belied the rough journey behind it. Its sail, once bright and proud, hung tired and patched from hurried repairs done at sea. Salt crusted the beards and cloaks of the men who stood at the oars, their eyes hollow with weeks of sleepless nights, of brine and wind and the cold bite of foreign blades. Yet when the prow scraped the shingle and the first boots splashed into the shallows, none of that mattered. Wives rushed forward, hands pressed to their mouths, eyes searching for the face they knew too well. Children clung to father's legs, staring up at the weathered skin and tangled hair, half afraid of these giants who returned like strangers made from salt and steel. There were greetings of joy and grief alike. Not all who had sailed out returned. Gaps stood raw among the crew, absences that no silver or fine cloth could mend. Some women wept into the sea's roar, their mourning hidden behind their hair. Others bit back tears and forced smiles, for the living needed strong arms and steady hearts more than sorrow. From the ship's belly came the fruits of distant coasts, bolts of colored silk, beads that glittered like caught starlight, small casks of wine so sweet it clung to the tongue like a dream. And always silver, rings and coins, brooches torn from noble necks, bribes paid under moonlight to spare a village, or seized by force when no bargain could be struck. These treasures were counted and divided with rough fairness beneath the eyes of the chieftain, each man taking his share home to scatter across his hearth, payment for the risk of salt and steel. Yet the wealth did not wash away the hardships behind it. As the men stripped off salt-crusted tunics and lowered weary bodies into steaming baths, stories were spoken at first in low voices, tales of storms that rose like living beasts, of rival ships with sharper oars and colder hearts, of foreign kings whose halls glittered with gold, yet were guarded by blades honed fine enough to slice through Viking bone. These stories drifted from the steamy warmth of the bathhouses to the glow of the longhouse hearths. There, the returning men sat wrapped in fresh wool and furs, children perched wide-eyed at their feet. They spoke of lands where the sun burned hotter than any hearth in the north, where gardens spilled fruit onto warm stones and city walls rose higher than the tallest pine. They spoke of riches that made a man's head spin with want, and of dangers that made the cold fjords feel merciful in comparison. But beneath the telling lay an unspoken truth. Every coin brought home was paid for many times over. By the cut of an axe, the crack of a shield, the salt spray that stole warmth from the marrow of their bones. By the memory of a friend whose laughter was left behind on some foreign shore, where no cairn of stone would mark his name. Still, they laughed, these hardened men. They clapped each other on the shoulders, boasted of wounds that would ache with the coming winter's cold, lifted mugs of mead high to the sagas that would be sung in their name. For now they were home, and their return wove another bright thread through the tapestry of a people who survived by the sea's fickle grace. Outside, the northern night never truly came. The sun dipped low but clung stubbornly to the horizon, painting the fjord in ghostly gold. Smoke curled from the longhouses, drifting out to sea as if to greet the next ships that would one day return, or not. And in that pale half-dark, the Vikings dreamed their brutal dreams once more, of sails and storms, of gold and grave mounds, of winters that would come too soon, and summers that always felt too short when the sea still called their names. In the lull that followed the return of the longships, the village settled once more into its fragile rhythm, like the steady beat of a drum echoing in the valley long after the warrior's footsteps faded into the earth. Silver and silks, beads and brooches, these treasures glimmered for a time in the smoky light of the longhouse before finding their way into hidden chests, bartered away for grain, livestock, or tools that would better guard against the endless turning of the seasons. Men who had stood shoulder to shoulder in distant lands now found their places at the plow once more, hands that had gripped axe and oar turning instead to the humble tools of the farm. There was no shame in this return to the soil, for every warrior knew that steel alone did not fill bellies or mend roofs battered by storms. And so, the swords were oiled and wrapped in cloth, tucked away behind carved beams, while the men bent their backs beneath the summer sun to harvest the promise they had sown when spring first softened the frozen ground. In the meadows, hayfields swayed in slow, golden waves, their sweet scent filling the air as scythes cut them down in broad, patient strokes. Fathers and sons worked side by side, sweat streaking sun-browned brows as they turned the cut grass and left it to dry beneath the sky's watchful eye. Women and girls gathered the hay into neat stacks, laughter mingling with the drone of bees that drifted lazily from flower to flower. Even the smallest children lent their hands, stumbling under armfuls of fragrant hay, their cheeks ruddy with effort and pride. Beyond the fields, sheep and cattle grazed contentedly under the wide sky, their bells a gentle chorus on the breeze. They too were wealth, their well-fed bodies, a promise against the hunger that lurked behind every shadow of winter. The flocks were counted each dusk, penned close to the longhouses at night, where keen-eyed dogs and watchful boys stood guard against prowling wolves, or the sudden mischief of roaming thieves. Inside the houses, the newly returned goods brought a short-lived sparkle to daily life. A wife might braid bright beads into her hair or stitch a swatch of foreign silk into the hem of her cloak. Children clutched tiny carved trinkets, a horse, a bird, a little boat, to their chests as they drifted into sleep by the warmth of the hearth. For a while, these small treasures made the hardships of long months feel lighter, though everyone knew such comforts could never stand alone against the cold winds waiting on the horizon. And yet, among the people, there was pride, a deep, bone-set pride that came not only from plunder, but from endurance. They had weathered the dark, survived the lean, sent their bravest to test the far edges of the world, and welcomed them home again, if only for a while. Around the hearth, tales of raiding and trading mingled with the simpler stories of planting and reaping, of a stubborn calf born in a storm, of a child's first step across the dirt floor, of laughter that rose even when the sky turned dark and the wind howled like a beast at the door. In these small stories, the soul of the North beat steady and strong. For all their ferocity on distant shores, it was this quiet, relentless will that truly bound the Vikings to the land that raised them. They were not kings in marble halls, but folk of timber and iron, of salt and frost. People who knew the worth of a warm hearth and a full larder, who sang of gods, but trusted more in their own hands. As the harvest neared its peak, the village prepared for the gathering of grain. Sickle blades were sharpened on whetstones worn smooth by generations of toil. Baskets were mended, clay jars checked for cracks, storehouses swept of last year's stray husks and mouse droppings. The coming days would test every arm and back, for the harvest was a race against the sky's shifting moods. A sudden storm could flatten barley in an afternoon. An early frost could steal the promise of a whole field overnight. Yet there was a strange sweetness in this urgency, a sense that for all its hardness, life here was measured in honest labor and the soft hush of the wind through ripe grain. Each evening as the sun dipped low but refused to fully set, families gathered in the fields for a last meal before sleep. They sat on sheaves of cut hay, passing bread and cheese between rough hands, laughter and quiet talk drifting into the warm dusk. At the edges of the gathering, the elders watched with eyes that had seen more seasons than they cared to count. They knew how thin the line was between feast and famine, between the songs of plenty and the silence of hunger. And so they spoke soft words to the gods of earth and sky, leaving small offerings among the stalks, crumbs of bread, a drop of ale poured into the soil, simple gestures to remind the land they were still listening, still grateful, still hoping. When sleep came, it found the people of the north spread beneath roofs of timber or the vast canopy of stars, their bodies heavy with labor, but their spirits threaded with a quiet satisfaction. In dreams, they might hear the distant whisper of waves against a ship's hull, the soft cry of a wolf in the woods, the rustle of barley under moonlight. Small reminders that life here was never truly tamed, only endured, only embraced, season by season, beneath the wide and watchful northern sky. As the long days of harvest stretched onward, the air grew thick with the earthy scent of cut grain and trampled grass. In every corner of the village, life pulsed with the quiet urgency of hands and backs bent to the will of the land. Sickles hissed through golden stalks like whispered promises, and the sound of laughter and labor wove together in a harmony older than any saga sung in the longhouse. The fields, once stubborn and stony, now yielded their treasure in neat bundles laid out beneath the stubborn northern sun. Men and women moved in lines, sweeping across the barley like a tide of flesh and cloth, gathering each stalk with careful hands. The older boys joined them now, shoulders stiff, but eyes bright with the pride of earning their place among those who fed the hearth. Even the smallest children trailed behind, gathering stray ears of grain that fell from careless fingers, their small baskets brimming with humble prizes. Among the workers strode the chieftain, his broad shoulders cloaked not in the fine silks brought from foreign raids, but in plain wool marked with simple runes of protection. He stopped here and there, exchanging quiet words with those who bent at the rows, asking after an old wound, praising a well-bound sheaf, reminding all who met his gaze that the wealth of the north was measured first in its fields, not its silver. His presence lent a steady weight to the toil, a reminder that even the fiercest warrior must bow his head to the earth that fed him. Nearby, the river sang its constant song, carrying the chill of distant mountains down through reeds and alder groves. Women gathered along its banks at dusk, washing sweat-stiff tunics and laughing over the splash of children chasing minnows in the shallows. They spoke of the yield so far, good, better than last year if the weather held. They spoke, too, of the men at sea, of the ships that might yet come slipping through the fjords' mist with more wealth to trade for what could not be grown or caught at home. When the sun dipped low enough to brush the hills in strokes of purple and gold, the families drifted back toward the cluster of timbered longhouses. The air smelled of smoke and fresh bread, of stews thick with onions and a few precious scraps of salted meat. In the courtyards, fires crackled in wide stone hearths as neighbors gathered to share the evening meal beneath the watchful sky. Songs rose softly here, nothing grand, nothing that would echo across kingdoms, but enough to carry comfort through the dusk. Elders sat near the flames, their eyes reflecting firelight and memory both. They spoke sparingly, their words weighed like silver, reminders that even a good harvest could vanish like mist if not guarded with care. They knew too well the lean winters, the storms that could shake a roof loose in the middle of the night, the sudden illness that took a child faster than any raid or blade. Yet for all their caution, even they could not hide the quiet satisfaction that hummed beneath the talk. This year, the gods willing, there would be bread enough for all. Farther from the warmth of the fires, the youth gathered in shadows just beyond the ring of light. Boys and girls balanced between childhood and the burdens of grown life. They whispered of things that made their cheeks flush and their laughter sharp as hawthorn. Some spoke boldly of the raids they would join next season, of ships they would build, of gold they would carry back in hidden pouches. Others spoke of simpler dreams, a plot of land, a warm hearth, children of their own to carry the old songs forward. As the moon rose, thin and white above the dark pines, the village settled into uneasy rest. The men and women who labored by day lay down on straw beds, the weight of honest exhaustion pressing them into sleep. In dreams they felt again the tug of scythes through grain, the soft hush of wind through ripening barley, the river's steady lullaby carrying their hopes toward the distant sea. But not all slept soundly. Some lay awake, listening to the restless creak of beams above their heads, the occasional cry of a night bird, or the low growl of a hunting wolf beyond the pasture fences. They thought of storms that might come too soon, of blight that could strike without warning, of feuds that sometimes flared like sparks among neighbors when harvests turned thin. These were the shadows that no gold nor God could fully chase away. Yet come dawn, they would rise again with the sun that never truly left the north for long. They would shoulder their tools and gather once more beneath the wide, pale sky, moving row by row through fields that gleamed like coins scattered by a generous hand. They would stack the grain high in storehouses sealed with carved runes, each sheaf a promise against the long nights ahead. And when at last the last stalk fell, when the fields lay bare and the barns full, they would gather to feast, not in the name of kings or raiders, but in quiet tribute to the soil itself. For the Vikings knew well that their fiercest enemy was not a foreign army nor a rival clan, but hunger. And it was in these golden sheaves and calloused hands that their true victory lay, season after hard-won season, beneath the shifting, unyielding northern sky. When the final sheaf was bound and carried into the dark mouth of the barn, a hush settled over the village that was not silence, but a slow, collective breath held in gratitude. The fields lay bare beneath the wide sweep of the sky, their stubbled rows bathed in the last warmth of a sun, now losing its strength to the distant whisper of autumn's chill. In the corners of the yards, loose straw drifted like golden threads, catching on boots and doorposts, a gentle reminder of the labor just completed and the promise tucked safely behind stout timber walls. In these brief days between harvest and the first frost, the people of the North turned their minds to what must come next. For the land, generous now, would soon harden under the iron hand of winter, and every soul knew that what had been gathered must be guarded as fiercely as any plunder. The barns were checked for leaks and gaps, roof beams tested with rough hands and careful eyes. Barley and rye were packed in woven sacks, stacked high in corners lined with fresh straw to keep out the cold and the gnaw of hungry mice. Near the longhouses, smoke curled steady from stone chimneys as fires were kindled for the work of preservation. Women moved like shadows through the drifting wood smoke, laying out fish to dry on racks, salting what meat they could spare from the herd. Cauldrons bubbled with stews of root vegetables and scraps of game, seasoned with the last of the summer herbs. Into clay jars they poured thick berry preserves, sweet enough to remind them in the depths of winter that the sun would one day return to kiss the hills green again. Within the low, sturdy storehouses, the air grew heavy with the mingled scent of hay, dried fish, and the faint musk of grain. Boys were set to guard these hoards when the nights grew longer, for every village knew that hunger made thieves of even decent men. And beyond the walls, wolves too would come prowling when snow buried the forests deep, their thin howls echoing through the fjord like sorrow carried on the wind. Still, there was joy to be had in these tasks, simple and honest as the warmth of the hearth. In the evenings, when the sun slipped lower each day, families gathered in the glow of the fire to mend nets, patch cloaks, and carve new handles for tools worn smooth by summer's toil. The returned warriors sat with children at their knees, rough hands guiding small ones over the grain of wood, showing them how to shape a simple spoon or a fishing hook from bone. Stories rose with the smoke, drifting up to the timbered beams where herbs hung drying for winter brews. Some tales were of the gods, of Odin's endless quest for wisdom, of Thor's hammer crashing thunder across the mountains, of sly Loki, who could not help but twist fate like a thread in clever fingers. Others were closer to the hearth, of the year the barley sprouted tall despite an early frost, or the hunt when a lone boy brought down a stag larger than any seen in memory. Laughter lingered late in the longhouse, echoing against carved posts, polished by the touch of generations. And when the fire sank low and the embers glowed like distant stars, those who lay down to sleep did so with bellies full and spirits soothed, if only for the night. Outside, the air sharpened hour by hour, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth, the quiet promise that frost would soon lace the fields where the barley had grown tall. In these dwindling days of warmth, the young ones ran barefoot still, chasing each other through the last patches of green. They played at raids and hunts, swinging sticks like swords, shouting challenges to invisible foes beneath the patient watch of the birch trees. Mothers called them in with the dusk, brushing burrs from tangled hair and warming chilled hands over the hearth before tucking them under furs that smelled faintly of smoke and thyme. Meanwhile, the elders, keepers of old ways and older fears, sat by the doorways at twilight, watching the stars emerge one by one through drifting clouds. They felt the shift in the wind, the way it bit at the edges of cloaks, the hush that settled over the forest paths when the sun dipped behind the hills. They remembered leaner years when the storehouses were not so full, when a sudden rot or an early storm turned hope to dust faster than any blade. Yet this year, the barns were heavy with grain, the nets mended strong, the axes sharpened, and the boats patched and tarred against the salt's slow hunger. There would be hardship, there always was, but for now, they had done what they could. The rest lay in the hands of the gods, or the mercy of a world that seldom gave much of either. So they rose with the dawn and set about their quiet fortifications. Fences were mended, traps set for the small game that might still fatten a stew, chickens clucked behind stout wooden pens, pigs rooted in pens layered thick with straw. The last of the hay was hauled into the lofts under the steep roofs, where the weight of snow could slide harmlessly to the ground when the storms arrived. And when, at last, the first breath of frost touched the meadow grass, laying a silver edge upon every blade, the Vikings of that quiet fjord turned inward to the warmth they had kindled through sweat and care. In this narrow space between abundance and scarcity, they found a fragile peace, hard-earned, easily lost, yet theirs for now beneath the ever-shifting, ever-challenging northern sky. As the frost deepened its hold upon the waking world, the meadows stiffened beneath a fragile veil of silver, and the once green fields lay silent and hard, stripped bare by the sickle and now guarded only by the hush of winter's approach. The North, for all its fleeting gifts, was never gentle for long, and in these first true days of cold, the Vikings felt anew the burden of the life they had chosen, or rather, the life that had chosen them. Each morning, a thin mist rose from the river, curling ghost-like around the bare branches of birch and alder. The water still ran swift and cold, yet its edges had begun to crust with ice, delicate at first, just enough to crack beneath a careless footstep, reminding children to mind their play. Soon it would thicken, a clear pane of glass over the current's stubborn song, and the boats would be pulled further ashore, propped high upon logs to keep the creeping frost from biting too deep into their hulls. Inside the longhouses, the air grew thicker with the scents of smoked fish, drying herbs, and the constant churn of hearth smoke drifting up through gaps in the roof beams. Women, wrapped in layers of wool and fur, moved about their work with steady resolve. They spun flax into thread by the glow of oil lamps, their fingers dry and cracked from days of winding the coarse fibers into something that might shield a shoulder or mend a worn tunic when the snows lay deep. The men tended to tasks that would not wait for the snow to bury the paths. Axes flashed in the forest, biting into pine and birch, sending up the clean, sharp scent of fresh sap beneath the cold air. Logs were split and stacked in tall, careful piles near each longhouse wall, the promise of warmth banked up against the gnaw of the wind. Even boys, barely grown strong enough for a spear, were handed hatchets, taught the art of chopping without splitting the wood too fine or splintering their own feet. Livestock, restless under the thickening cold, were coaxed into winter pens lined with straw that would need constant tending. Goats and sheep bleated softly as they pressed against one another for warmth. Cows lowed deep and steady, their breath rising in plumes that caught the flicker of torchlight at dusk. Each beast was counted, fed, checked for signs of sickness, for to lose even one to the creeping frost was to lose a measure of life come spring. Evenings now belonged to the hearth in full. The circle of warmth was a refuge against the tightening chill that clawed at every shutter and door frame. Here families gathered, the day's work trailing behind them like steam off wet boots left by the fire. Children pressed close to mothers who mended seams or embroidered small runes into the hems of tunics. Blessings stitched into linen to ward off whatever spirits might linger in the frozen dark beyond the walls. The men traded stories over carved mugs of mead, voices low but full of the same fierce spark that had carried them over storm-broken seas. They spoke of raids past, of kings whose halls had been bright with silver, of narrow escapes through tangled marshes or under moonlit skies where no friendly star seemed to guide them home. And they spoke too of the sea, that cruel companion, that giver and taker both, how it waited now, hidden beneath ice and wind, dreaming its deep cold dreams until the thaw would wake it once more. In the quiet corners of the longhouse, the elders watched and listened, their faces carved with lines as deep as fjords. They knew what it was to survive the deep cold, to wake in the night and listen for the soft, dreadful sound of snow slipping from the roof or the shriek of a gale that could shear timbers loose if the gods were ill-tempered. Their memories stretched back through winters so harsh that children were fed the last crumbs of bread while parents gnawed on boiled leather and hope alike. And yet, for all that, the hearth fire burned. The walls stood strong. The stores were full enough for now, the tools sharp and ready. In this fragile span between the dying of autumn and the full bite of winter, there was room for laughter, quiet but real. A child's giggle when a stray ember popped from the fire, a soft song hummed by a mother as she rocked an infant to sleep, a snatch of teasing banter between young men comparing the trophies of the last raid, their eyes already drifting toward the window's frost-blurred darkness, imagining the sea's return. Outside, the world shrank to the reach of torchlight and the crunch of boots on frozen earth. Night fell early and clung late. Wolves padded the tree line, their shapes just shadows among the skeletal birches, their eyes catching stray moonlight like drops of molten silver. Sometimes, at the edge of hearing, a lone howl would rise, thin and distant, yet sharp enough to slice through the warmth inside, reminding all who listened that the wildness of this place never truly yielded to hearth or blade. But within those timbered walls, the people of the north laid claim to their small dominion. They pressed close to the fire, mended their nets and tools, sharpened their knives against what might come. They whispered to the gods who might be listening, poured small offerings into the hearth's hungry mouth, and trusted in the work of their hands to carry them through. For they knew, as they always had, that no storm, no frost, no famine could truly break them while they held to one another and the quiet, stubborn flame that burned at the heart of every Viking home, fierce enough to push back even the longest, darkest night beneath the unyielding northern sky. In the hush of dawn, when the fjords still wore their soft veils of mist, the Vikings of the northern shores rose from their slumber to find themselves yet again within the cruel clasp of winter's final breath. It was in these lingering days before the thaw that life revealed its harshest truths, for the ice did not release its hold willingly, and the sea, so generous in summer, became a frigid barrier that mocked their hunger. In the settlement of Stenvik, a cluster of timber walls braced against the biting wind, families gathered round the embers of hearths that had burned low through the night. Smoke clung to thatched roofs, drifting into the gray sky like prayers unanswered. Inside one such dwelling, old Einar, known for his stories as much as his scars, sat before the hearth, tracing the rim of his wooden cup with a gnarled finger. Around him huddled the youngest of the clan, wide-eyed despite the dawn's weariness, drawn not just by the promise of warmth, but by Einar's voice that wove the old tales into the fabric of their fears. "You think the cold is cruel?" Einar rasped, his breath a ghost in the chill. "It is nothing compared to the hunger that follows when the ice won't break. When the fish dive deep and the game finds haven in the heart of the forest, where snow buries even the hunter's hope." He spoke of a winter many years past, when he himself was but a lad of 10 winters, strong in spirit yet lean as the wolves that howled beyond the palisade. That year, the sea froze near to shore, turning boats into idle ornaments, and the nets, now useless, hung stiff in the wind. His father, a man of wide shoulders and few words, had led a desperate hunt inland with a band of gaunt men who returned with little more than frostbitten fingers and hollow eyes. To stave off death, the people of Stenvik learned to eat roots pulled from beneath the snow, bark scraped from trees, and what little stores of grain they could barter from neighboring villages that fared no better. They spoke in hushed voices of those who did not survive. Infants wrapped in cloths that became shrouds, elders who fell asleep beside the fire and did not wake. Yet through it all, they did not despair openly, for to speak of surrender was to invite it into the home. Einar's eyes, roomy yet sharp in the flicker of flame, met those of a boy named Life, whose ribs showed beneath his tunic, though he tried to sit tall and brave. The old man's voice softened then, like snow drifting onto a silent field. "And still we rose each dawn," he said. "We broke the ice with our fists if we must. We walked for miles to find a hare's trail. We gave the strongest morsel to those who might swing an axe come spring." Beyond the walls, the sound of the wind rose, carrying with it the distant creak of trees heavy with frost. Somewhere out there, young men tested their blades against logs, dreaming of raids that might fill their larders and chests with silver. They did not yet know that the greatest enemy they would face was not the Saxon or the Frank, but the land itself, which gave life grudgingly and reclaimed it with ruthless indifference. At the edge of Stenvik, a woman named Fritis trudged through the knee-deep drifts to check the traps she had set the evening before. Her hands, wrapped in wool, trembled as she lifted the crude snares, each empty save for one, inside which lay a single half-frozen stoat. She whispered thanks to the old gods, though her breath fogged the air and froze on her lashes. It was a meager catch, but it was something. Tonight, her children would taste meat, though it might be shared among many. Back in the village, the blacksmith Olaf struck iron in the cold, though the metal protested beneath his hammer. Sparks flew, faint warmth against the vast chill. Olaf's forge was the heartbeat of the settlement, where axes were mended, nails forged, and in these lean days, hope itself beaten back into shape. Yet even Olaf knew that no amount of steel could fend off famine if the weather did not break soon. The sun crawled higher, though its light brought little heat. Children, thin and wide-eyed, played at the edge of the palisade, their laughter fragile in the hush. They built little forts from snow and imagined they were ships, sailing far south to where warmth and food lay in abundance. Such dreams kept them light, their stomachs growling beneath layers of fur. As dusk began its slow descent, the men gathered in the longhouse, the heart of counsel and quarrel alike. Here they spoke of the weeks ahead, of the food that must stretch until the first thaw freed the streams, and the fish returned to their nets. A hush fell when Harold, the chieftain's eldest son, rose to speak. His voice was calm, but his eyes betrayed the weight he carried. "We have word," he said, his gaze sweeping over the assembled faces, all hollow-cheeked and hungry for promise. "Far to the west, near the islands where the sea is less cruel, there are seals aplenty. If we can make the crossing, if we can break through the ice, there may yet be enough meat and fat to see us through." A murmur rose, hope tempered by fear. The sea was treacherous, even in fair weather, and in the clutches of ice it became a grave for the unwary. Yet desperation was a fierce oar that drove even the most reluctant sailor forward. They spoke long into the night, the fire burning low, voices carrying the weight of life and death across the timber walls. When Einar rose to leave, he paused at the door, looking back at the circle of men bent close in quiet argument. He remembered well the hunger that made brave men reckless, and the ice that could swallow the strongest heart without a whisper of remorse. Outside, the moon rose pale above the fjord, its light spilling silver upon a world that cared nothing for the plight of man. In this, the Vikings were forged, not in the clash of sword and shield upon foreign shores, but here, in the silent war against cold and hunger, in the unseen battles fought at dawn, when the mist rose from the sea and the sun lingered low, promising warmth that never truly came. Here they learned to endure, to bind themselves to one another with cords of kinship and story, to face each cruel dawn with a blade in hand and a prayer on the lips. So the night settled over Stenvik once more, a blanket of frost and dreams, and whispered hopes for the break of spring. The wind sang its lonely song through the pines, and beneath their rough-hewn roofs, the people of the north clung to one another, hearts beating slow in the dark, waiting for the sun that might one day return in full and bring with it a mercy the land too often forgot. When dawn broke once more over Stenvik, the pale sun found men readying their small boats along the frozen inlet. The ice near the shore had begun to crack in thin, jagged lines that splintered outward like veins beneath translucent skin, a sign that the sea, grudgingly, would soon permit passage. Word had spread swiftly through the settlement of Harold's plan to seek the seal herds far to the west, and though fear curled in every heart, it was hope that steeled their hands against the cold. Inside his dwelling, Harold stood beside his father, the chieftain Bjorn, a man who bore age with a stoic dignity that none dared question. Bjorn's hair was white as the snow beyond the door, but his eyes were keen as the spear that rested above his hearth, a relic from raids long past, when he himself had sailed rivers deep into foreign kingdoms, bringing back silver, cloth, and tales of lands where winter did not gnaw at the bones quite so cruelly. "You know the risk," Bjorn said, voice low, roughened by years and the smoke of countless winters. "The sea is not yet soft. The ice will not yield kindly to small boats." Harold nodded, tightening the bindings on his fur cloak. "I do, father, but the children's bellies are hollow. If we stay, we starve. If we sail, we might yet live." Bjorn regarded his son for a moment, the silence between them filled with the crackle of the hearth and the distant cries of gulls returning to the thawing shore. Then he placed a heavy hand upon Harold's shoulder, an unspoken blessing passed from father to son when words could do no more. Outside, families gathered along the snowy bank to watch the small party prepare. Wives pressed rough-woven mittens into their husbands' hands. Mothers kissed sons on brows furrowed with quiet dread. No one spoke of what might happen if the boats foundered in the shifting ice, or if the wind rose fierce across open water. These fears lived in the hollow of each chest, too old to name yet too stubborn to banish. Leif, the boy who had listened to old Einar's tale by the hearth, lingered among the watchers. His breath steamed in the morning cold, eyes wide as he watched Harald and the others push their boats closer to the ice's edge, where dark water showed itself like a wound in the white. Beside him stood Einar, wrapped in a cloak that had seen more seasons than some men lived to count. He leaned on his staff, every knot in the wood mirroring the bent lines of his spine. "When I was your age," Einar said, his voice drifting on the breeze, "I thought the sea was our cruelest master. But she is only what she has always been, endless, hungry, and fair in her own cold manner." Life shivered, not from the cold alone. "Will they come back?" he asked. Einar's eyes stayed fixed on the boats, now half afloat in the black channel carved through the ice. "Some will, some may not. That is how it has always been, boy. The sea gives and the sea takes. We are only ever guests on her back." With a shove and a creak of timber, the first boat slipped free, its oars biting at the frigid water. Harold stood at the prow, his gaze steady on the horizon that promised seals and salvation, or a death whispered beneath cracking ice. One by one, the other boats followed, men leaning into their oars, muscles burning to keep the cold from settling too deep in their bones. Those left behind watched until the shapes of boat and man blurred into the vast, pale distance. A hush settled over the shoreline, broken only by the restless wind sighing through the firs. Mothers herded their children back to the warmth of homes where thin porridge simmered and fires burned low. There would be waiting now, days of it, long and anxious as a dark sea under a moonless sky. Back within the walls of Stenvik, life pressed on as it always did. Freydis, with her snares and quiet resolve, checked her traps once more, hoping for a rabbit or a grouse that might grant a day's reprieve from hunger's gnaw. Olaf the blacksmith tended the forge with his apprentice, sharpening blades that might yet carve meat from seals or defend the village if raiders came prowling while the men were gone. Even old Einar found his place near the hearth, gathering the young ones to him again. Stories, after all, were as necessary as bread in times like these. As night fell, the wind rose, rattling shutters and sighing through the gaps in timber walls. Inside, families huddled close, their breath warm against one another's skin. They spoke softly, if at all, of the hunt, of the ice, of the brave souls rowing westward beneath a sky that promised neither kindness nor cruelty, only endless possibility. Far out upon the sea, the boats drifted between islands of jagged ice that ground and split with a sound like thunder rolled into the deep. The men rowed in shifts, shoulders aching, fingers raw against wooden oars. Harold sat watchful at the prow, eyes searching the horizon for any sign of the herds they sought. Dark shapes lounging upon floes, fat with blubber that could be rendered into warmth and life. They spoke little, for the sea itself was conversation enough. The groan of shifting ice, the slap of water against hulls, the creak of frost-bitten planks. Each man kept his thoughts tucked close to his chest, prayers for safe return, for a bounty great enough to feed every hollow belly back home. Above them, the sky cleared for a time, revealing stars sharp as spear points. To these men, the stars were old companions, guides and witnesses both. Beneath that vast, cold brilliance, they rode on, chasing the fragile thread that might yet bind them to another dawn. And so the night deepened over Stenvik and the sea alike. One dark with waiting, the other dark with the promise of salvation or oblivion. Within their small homes, the people of Stenvik dreamed uneasy dreams of fat seals and warm fires, of boats that returned heavy with life's cruel ransom paid in full. And the sea, as ever, kept her secrets beneath the drifting ice and the restless, whispering wind. In the darkness before dawn, when the sea seemed a single, endless breath of cold, the boats bearing Harald and his men drifted through the shifting lanes of broken ice. The creak of timber and the soft splash of oars were the only sounds to mark their passage, for the men spoke little now. Words were costly things when breath turned to frost upon their lips. Instead, they shared glances, nods, the silent covenant of those who had chosen risk over certain death at home. Above, the sky showed the first threads of gray light. The wind carried the brine of open water, and with it, the faint promise that they had sailed far enough to find the herds that lay beyond the ice's cruel reach. Harold, standing at the prow, narrowed his eyes against the rising wind. His fingers, raw from the oar and the cold, traced the haft of the harpoon that lay at his feet. A weapon older than him, carved by his father when Bjorn was still strong enough to row these same seas. Behind him, Eric, youngest among them, but broad of shoulder and fierce of heart, broke the silence with a low voice. "Look there," he said, pointing toward a distant stretch of gray where white shapes shifted lazily upon an ice floe. The men followed his gaze, hearts quickening at the sight. Seals, a dozen or more, sprawled upon the frozen plain, as though mocking the men who had come so far to find them. Fat, sleek bodies glistening where the dawn's weak light found them. Enough meat and oil to stave off the hunger clawing at Stenvik's door. If only the sea would grant them this single mercy. Harold signaled for silence, raising a gloved hand. They drew their oars in tight, letting the tide carry them closer, the boats gliding like shadows between slabs of ice. Each man readied his harpoon or club, breath held tight in lungs that burned with cold and anticipation. The seals stirred, some lifting their heads, whiskers twitching at the scent of strange men drifting closer through the morning hush. When the boats were near enough that Harold could see the steam of the animal's breath rising into the dawn, he nodded once, sharp, decisive. The first harpoon struck true, burying deep into thick blubber. A sharp bark of alarm tore through the air as the seals stirred in panic, but already the men were upon them, leaping from boats to floe, feet slipping on the frozen surface, clubs rising and falling in grim rhythm. It was brutal, necessary work. The sea gave nothing freely. Each seal felled was a night's warmth, a child's meal, another day when death might be kept at the threshold. Blood spread in dark pools across the ice, staining white with the story of survival that had played out this way since the first of their kin had taken to these waters. When it was done, the men stood amid their prize, chests heaving, hands slick with warmth that would soon be rendered into oil and meat. Harold looked at his men, faces flushed, eyes bright with the fierce relief that followed such hunts. He counted heads, counted seals, calculated the weight each boat could bear, without foundering on the long passage home. They worked swiftly then, carving blubber and hide from muscle, binding the heavy carcasses with rope and dragging them back to the boats. The ice beneath their boots cracked and groaned, threatening betrayal with every careless step. Still they moved with the surety of men who knew the price of hesitation. When the sun, pale and weak as it was, climbed higher in the sky, they pushed off once more. The boat sat lower now, heavy with the bounty of the hunt, and the men rowed with a quiet, grim determination. They spoke in low murmurs of how the children would eat well, how fires would burn hotter for the fat they would render, how Stenvik might yet see spring with strength enough to greet the season of raiding when the ice finally broke for good. Yet for all the hope, the sea remained vigilant. By midday, the wind shifted, rising with a bite that stung cheeks raw and froze blood onto fur. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon, a promise of squalls that might turn a hard journey into a deadly one. Harald ordered the men to lash the cargo tight, every knot checked and checked again. They knew the sea could undo a man's fortune as swiftly as it granted it. Back in Stenvik, the village stirred with cautious anticipation. Word had come from scouts who had climbed the ridge above the fjord that Harald's party had not turned back empty-handed. Fires were stoked higher, empty pots ready to receive the precious meat and fat that would come home with the returning boats. Freydis stood outside her small dwelling, her children pressed against her skirts. She scanned the horizon with eyes narrowed against the biting wind, whispering old prayers to gods both named and nameless. Prayers that the boats would find their way through the ice, that no sudden squall would swallow them whole. Inside the longhouse, Bjorn waited, sitting near the fire that burned low despite the extra wood laid upon it. His hands rested on his knees, fingers drumming an old rhythm that none could place, perhaps the echo of waves against a hull, or the heartbeat of a man who had led many such journeys before his bones turned brittle and his spear grew too heavy to lift. When the first faint shape of a boat appeared against the gray wash of sea and sky, a cry went up from the palisade. Word spread swift as fire through dry grass. Men and women poured from their homes, gathering at the water's edge to greet the returning hunters. Children, perched on fence posts, wide-eyed and shivering in the wind, waiting for the first sight of seals, of fathers, brothers, uncles bent beneath the weight of salvation. The boats came slow but sure, cutting through the narrow lanes of thawing ice. Harald stood once more at the prow, spear in hand, not raised in threat, but as a standard that declared victory over hunger, if only for a while. As the hulls scraped against the shore, rough cheers rose into the cold air, raw, exhausted, yet rich with relief. Hands reached to haul the cargo ashore, heavy, fragrant, with the harsh scent of salt and blood, and life won back from the brink. Children pressed close to catch glimpses of the seals, already dreaming of the stews that would bubble upon the hearth, the warmth that would chase sleep through nights that no longer echoed with empty stomachs. And so, for a moment, Stenvik breathed easier. The sea, so brutal and indifferent, had relented, if only for this day. But even in their joy, the people knew this was no end to their trials. The ice would return, the storms would come, and beyond the fjords, other enemies waited, men and weather alike. Yet tonight, there would be food. Tonight, there would be warmth. And for people who had learned to love fiercely in the spaces between cruel winters, that was enough. As dusk descended once more over Stenvik, the scent of rendered seal fat drifted through the narrow lanes between timber dwellings, weaving its way around snowdrifts and the rough stockade that held back the forest and the wolves alike. Fires burned higher that night than they had in many weeks, their orange glow flickering through shutters that rattled in the wind. The village, which only days before had seemed a place hollowed out by hunger and cold, now pulsed with a fragile warmth. Inside the longhouse, the heart of the settlement, families gathered shoulder to shoulder upon fur-covered benches. Above them, smoke drifted into the high beams, finding its way through a hole in the roof that framed a sliver of star-pricked sky. Along the central hearth, iron pots bubbled with stew richer than any had tasted since the first snows fell. Chunks of seal meat, strips of preserved root vegetables, wild herbs gathered and dried when the land still breathed warmth. Children sat cross-legged nearest the flames, faces flushed, eyes heavy yet unwilling to close for fear of missing another mouthful. Mothers whispered warnings to slow their eager hands, but few scolded too harshly. Each spoonful swallowed tonight was a promise that tomorrow might come a little easier. Harald sat apart from the revelry, near the entrance where the draft tugged at his furs. He watched the people he had led this far, watched them laugh, watched them eat, watched old rivalries slip into silence for one night at least. His hands, cracked and raw from rope and ice, rested upon his knees. The harpoon lay beside him, propped against the door, gleaming faintly in the firelight, a reminder that this reprieve was won by risk, not fortune alone. Beside him, his father Bjorn lowered himself slowly onto the bench, joints creaking like the hull of an old longship meeting the tide. The elder chieftain regarded his son for a time, the hush between them deep as any sea. "You brought them home," Bjorn said at last, voice rough as weathered wood. Harold did not look away from the firelight playing across the people's faces. For now, he answered softly. Bjorn's laugh was a dry rattle. For now is all we ever have, he said. Tomorrow, the ice will return, the storms will howl, but tonight they will remember you led them into the dark and brought them back with life in your hands. Harold's fingers drummed once on his knee, an old echo of Bjorn's habit. It was not my hands alone, he murmured. Each man in that boat held the line as tight as I did. And the sea. He paused, eyes narrowing at a draft that slipped under the door. The sea let us pass. This time. They sat together in silence, father and son, bound by the unspoken truth every man of the North learned at birth, that survival was never a gift freely given, but a prize pried from cold jaws by courage, cunning, and kinship. Beyond the longhouse walls, Freydis knelt at her hearth, feeding a crackling flame beneath a small iron pot. Her children dozed on a bed of pelts nearby, bellies full for the first time in many nights. She stirred the pot gently, humming an old tune her mother once sang in softer seasons, a song of fields that lay far beyond the mountains, where the sun lingered long and grain rose tall enough to hide a child. She could almost see it now, in the dance of shadow and flame, a vision of a summer that would come again, if only they could hold the ice at bay a little longer. A vision where her children might run barefoot through tall grass instead of snowdrifts, their laughter echoing between green hills rather than timber walls braced against the wind. Outside, the wind rose and fell, rattling the shutters, whispering its promise that the hard months were not yet done. Wolves howled from the forest's edge, drawn by the scent of fat and blood, but held back by the stockade and the watchful eyes of men who knew better than to sleep deeply when meat hung fresh within reach. In the forge, Olaf tended a low flame, hammering out rough knives from scraps of iron left behind when trade routes froze over. He hummed to himself, each strike a steady heartbeat that reminded him the living must keep their hands busy lest the cold creep into their bones. Sparks danced at his feet, fading into darkness like tiny defiant stars. Old Einar, wrapped in heavy furs, sat near his small fire, alone save for the steady crackle of burning wood and the stories that never left him, not even in the silence. He spoke softly to the embers, his voice drifting through the smoke like a blessing or a warning. "You think the worst is behind you, little village," he whispered, eyes half closed. "But the sea is deep and the world wider still. The hunger will return, and with it new storms, new enemies, new sorrows. But so too will courage. So too will tales worth telling when the cold presses close." He let the words fade as he leaned back, breath a faint ghost rising to the rafters. Beyond his walls, the night pressed in close, fierce yet momentarily held at bay by the stubborn warmth of people who refused to vanish quietly into the snow. Above Stenvik, the stars burned cold and bright. They had seen it all before. Men and women carving stubborn lives from frost-bitten earth, daring the sea's fury, defying the slow crush of hunger and despair. They would see it all again. And down below, within timber walls ringed by pines and ice, the Vikings of Stenvik slept, bellies full, hearts raw but fierce, dreaming of spring, of sails unfurled, of warmth that might come if only they endured a little longer. Tomorrow they would wake to frost on the roof beams, to chores that would never finish themselves, to the watchful eyes of a winter that was not yet done with them. But tonight, they had fire. Tonight, they had meat and story and the slow, steady promise that though life was brutal, it was theirs to claim night after unforgiving night, dawn after fragile dawn,